Please welcome Daniel Krauthammer to the stage.
Thank you, Bo, for that very kind introduction. My thanks to you and to everyone at the Savannah Book Festival for inviting me to speak here tonight and for your understanding and flexibility in rescheduling this talk when a family emergency made it impossible for me to be here when originally scheduled. And my very sincere thanks to all of you here in attendance tonight for setting aside the time in your schedules, not once, but twice after the rescheduling to come and hear me speak. It means a great deal to me. And it means so much to me because I know that that time, that commitment on all of your part is a sign of your interest and your respect for my father's work, for his words, for his character, and for his life. As you know, the occasion for this talk is the publication just a few months ago of my father's last and posthumous book, The Point of It All, A Lifetime of Great Loves and Endeavors. I was the editor of that book. It was a project my father started long before he became ill and long before I had any involvement in it at all. But when he was ill, and then when he knew he would not be able to complete it himself, he asked me and he entrusted me to finish it for him. I made him an oath that I would, and that I would make sure it was worthy of his name. I held myself and committed myself to that promise with every fiber of my being, and I strove to the very limits of my ability to make sure it was as good and true to him as I could possibly make it. I put much of the book together, chose much of its contents, and all of the final decisions rested on my shoulders. But much of it was already chosen and already in place when I became involved. And all of it, every word save my introduction and conclusion, were already written by my father's hand. I am merely the editor. He was the author. The arguments and ideas and principles were his. I strove only to be their guardian and to present them the best way I knew how, to make sure these thoughts and beliefs that my father cared about so deeply would be there for the world to have, now and forever. That is how I viewed my job in editing the book, and that's how I view my job here tonight. It's a real honor to be here with you. I only wish, so very deeply, it's an honor that could have been my father's rather than my own. But fate would have it otherwise, and so I will do my best to represent my father and his legacy, and to convey to you tonight what I think were some of the most important ideas he fought for in the pages of The Point of It All and throughout his career. I have to warn you, I'm quite new to all of this, to book tours, giving speeches, and most especially to the difficult balance of representing my father and his work, but not pretending to be his spokesperson in the days now beyond his life, or to interpret his thoughts for our own political moment. So I'll ask you to please bear with me as I try to do my very best in this effort. I'll begin by explaining a bit about the book, its origins, and its meaning, and then go on to speak a bit about how it fits into the context of my father's whole career and life's work. The Point of It All, as you may know, is a collection. In its pages are 91 different pieces, columns, essays, speeches, and other writings, some of them never before published anywhere else, that span across my father's entire 4-decade-long career. And they span a remarkable array of topics as well, from the areas you'd expect from Charles Krauthammer: politics, foreign and domestic policy, world history, political philosophy, to issues of deep moral and societal importance, like medical ethics, life and death decisions, diversity and equality, to fun topics of his own personal passions, like baseball, chess, and space exploration, and to deeply personal pieces on the nature of friendship, fatherhood, marriage, and what it means to live a good and worthy life. My father explored all this and more in the pages of his books, and what was even more incredible to me than the range of his expertise and insight and thoughtfulness were the clear linkages between all these seemingly disparate subjects, the through line, so to speak, connecting all these fascinating and important areas of human life. Making sure the book's contents were chosen, arranged, grouped, labeled, and introduced in the right way to make sure that that through line was as apparent to everyone else as it was to me. That was my task, my primary responsibility. And as I saw it, as the editor and shepherd of my father's book, that was my most important job. It was a daunting, difficult, and intimidating task. To be honest, I don't think I realized just how much work I was agreeing to when I took it on in full last summer. And I'm actually pretty glad, in retrospect, that the team at the publishing house only told me after I had completed the manuscript 3 months later that under normal circumstances, they would have allotted an entire year to finishing work on a book like that. The reason it was so hard and took so much work was that I desperately wished not to get it wrong. The one thing that got me through it, actually, and really the one reason I had enough confidence in myself to complete the task, was my father's own trust and confidence in me. There were many times I went back to an email exchange that he and I had back in 2013, shortly after the publication of his earlier collection, Things That Matter. I had read that book cover to cover in just a few sittings, and immediately after I finished, I sat down and wrote my father a long letter telling him how incredible and magisterial a work I thought it was. He wrote me a long letter back afterwards in response, and I'll read for you now part of that. He wrote, "I couldn't wait to tell you how extraordinarily powerful and moving your letter was, and how unbelievably discerning and penetrating. You made me see things I couldn't even see myself. I've been kicking myself for 2 days now, because in interview after interview, I've had no idea how to answer the question, what is this book about? And there you put it in one simple, absolutely stunning sentence. Everything that matters depends ultimately on politics." As soon as I read it, I stopped reading your letter, wrote it down, and with a few paragraphs of elaboration, and emailed it to myself so I wouldn't lose it. End quote. I thought then, and I still think now, that he gave me far too much credit. I felt I was just paraphrasing back to him what he had already written in his book. But sometimes it takes a fresh eye, an outsider's eye, to point out for you what was already there all along. And I was quite sure it was there all along. In the introduction to Things That Matter, he had written, quote, "While science, medicine, art, poetry, architecture, chess, space, sports, number theory, and all things hard and beautiful promise purity, elegance, and sometimes even transcendence, they are fundamentally subordinate. In the end, they must bow to the sovereignty of politics, because in the end, everything, high and low, and most especially high, lives or dies by politics. Because of its capacity, when benign, to allow all around it to flourish, and its capacity, when malign, to make all around it wither." It's an incredible passage, I think, for its huge breadth, literally taking in everything that matters to the human experience in its totality, and its succinct point that all of that, literally all of it, ultimately depends on getting our politics right. The point of it all follows these same themes in philosophy, because they're what underlay everything my father wrote about. But I think this book takes a different track, approaches the ideas from a different direction, and I think actually wrestles with these questions at an even deeper level. Now, it's at this moment I actually want to take a quick moment to pause and take a step back and talk about something else, someone else actually, before I return to this train of thought. And that someone is my grandmother, Krauthammer, my father's mother. Some of you may know that the reason I was not able to come give this talk when it was originally scheduled last month was that she fell ill and passed away that week. She was 97 and had lived a full and extraordinary life. And I'd like to honor her memory along with my father's tonight. And it occurred to me in these weeks, thinking about this upcoming talk, that her life story informs and is indicative of so much of what lay at the core of my father's thinking and his insights about the nature of history and politics. My grandmother was born in Antwerp, Belgium in 1921 to a prominent and prosperous Jewish family in that city, one with deep roots and one that was both large and close-knit. I remember the stories she told me about the street she grew up on, a single block on which her mother and all 6 of her aunts all had their houses in a row and all raised their families together. Now, personally, I'm not sure I could stay sane for more than 2 days living in this 24/7 family reunion environment. But to her, it was idyllic. That idyllic world, however, those long-built family roots were wiped away in May 1940 when the Nazis invaded the Low Countries, and my grandmother, just 19 years old at the time, had to flee, along with her entire family, along with the entire Jewish community of that city. And they were the lucky ones. Her entire world disappeared, and she had to start anew on foreign shores. Thank goodness she did, and did so, like my grandfather, with bravery and ingenuity and strength, or else I wouldn't be here tonight, nor would my father have ever been here. But so much else was lost, innumerable lives, and indeed a whole way of life. An entire continent plunged into the worst depravities of human cruelty and destruction. And how did this happen? As my father wrote, it was politics gone wrong, horribly wrong. My father's deep awareness of the Holocaust added, I think, a visceral intuition to his immense and broad intellectual understanding of the sweep and patterns of human history. He knew that history had no inevitable tendency toward progress and the good. That arrow of history, as he termed it, could just as easily turn backwards. Its direction determined by politics. And disastrous politics could lead to disastrous outcomes in ways that we find hard to believe. As he wrote, quote, "Politics is the moat, the walls beyond which lie the barbarians. Fail to keep them at bay, and everything burns." The 20th century, with its mass political enthusiasms, is a lesson in the supreme power of politics to produce ever-expanding circles of ruin, end quote. He wrote about the disasters of World War I, the Russian, Chinese, Vietnamese, and Cambodian revolutions, and he wrote about World War II. Quote, "Of course, the greatest demonstration of the finality of politics is the Holocaust, which in less than a decade destroyed a millennium-old civilization, sweeping away not only 6 million souls, but the institutions, the culture, the very tongue of the now vanished world of European Jewry. The only power comparably destructive belongs to God or nature, and yet even God cannot match the cruelty of his creation. That is the work of man, more particularly the work of politics, of groups of people organized to gain and exercise power." What is so particularly shocking, dismaying, and dispiriting about the example of the Holocaust is where it happened. It was not perpetrated by some undeveloped backwater nation, some holdover band of murderous Vikings frozen in time. Germany, in the first part of the 20th century, was the pinnacle of Western culture and civilization. A world leader in the arts, in industry, in the sciences, by nearly every metric that we measure the accomplishments of our species. But they got their politics wrong. disastrously wrong. And those politics methodically took hold and destroyed every other worthy aspect of German life and reverted that nation's sense of morality back to the Dark Ages. We find it hard to imagine the world can ever change that radically from the way we know it. It's simply human nature. And in our incredibly fortunate circumstances today, as citizens of this country, the freest and safest and most prosperous the world has ever known, it can be very hard to resist the blind assumption that everything will just continue to gradually get better forever. But it is not inevitable. It is not the default. Our circumstances, our success, our freedom, our human flourishing is always more precarious than we ever allow ourselves to appreciate. But my father did appreciate it. And that was the wellspring of his passion, the driving force and urgency behind his choice of career and behind every word he ever wrote about politics. There is a lot in the day-to-day work of a political pundit that falls short of such world-important subjects. And my father was always the first to joke about how much of his life he had to spend talking about the more tawdry and small stakes aspects of politics. I remember there was one time in the 90s when he got so sick of discussing the president's zipper problems that he began talking only half-jokingly about going back into medicine. But he always knew the real purpose he was there, and he always dug to a deeper level, many levels deeper often, than others would, on whatever the issue of the day was. He drilled down to the truly important and lasting principles, the questions at the heart of our communal life that are so intensely difficult to understand, let alone to answer. That is the high calling of politics. That is why he wrote. And that was why he wanted to put together this book, to collect the writings that dug into some of the questions that he thought were most important. It was my mother, actually, who came up with the title for The Point of It All, just as she did, by the way, for Things That Matter. She's pretty good at this, it turns out. And as soon as she proposed it, it struck me that it was exactly right. There is no other way, really, to sum up at once the incredible breadth of the book and also its simple and pointed argument. It expresses simultaneously the two deep beliefs my father held about politics that at once are seemingly paradoxical, but are also the ultimate logical endpoint of his core political philosophy: that the point of life should not be defined by politics, that the point of it all is what we choose and what we make of our own lives, the passions, the beliefs, the relationships, the truths we come to in charting our own paths and finding our own meaning in life. But that we can only enjoy the blessings of this freedom to choose if we get our politics right. Only if we avoid political systems that seek to dictate life's meaning and purpose for the individual. Only if we have a political system that establishes a stable and safe superstructure that leaves the individuals within it unmolested and free to find and choose their own meaning and purposes in life with each other. This is the core of what a pluralist, liberal democracy means, and my father believed in it deeply. He made the point of his own life and his career to do what he could in all the years that he had on this earth to maintain and strengthen and advance that system of free and open and successful politics. And he did it in a way that transfixed so many of us. He thought both deeply and broadly. His writing was both logical and artful. He was both serious and playful, realistic and optimistic. There are so many traits he combined in his being and in his writing and commentary that are quite rare to ever find together in the same place. All of these traits, of course, are parts of our ever-complex human nature, And I think one of the keys to my father's insights across so many subjects was his perceptive understanding of that human nature. He was a medical doctor and psychiatrist for nearly a decade before he changed career tracks to go into writing and politics. He always refrained from psychologizing and downplayed any notion that his earlier professional background gave him any particular insights when it came to politics. Though I will take one moment here to repeat one joke he did love to tell, which was when he was asked on many occasions if he ever used his psychiatric training in his political analysis. He would say, well, no, I'm not gonna claim to have any particular insight here, but I will say I do see some similarities between some of the patients I used to treat in Boston and some of the people I analyze here in Washington now. Both sets suffer from paranoia and delusions of grandeur. The difference is one of them has access to nuclear weapons. But on the more serious side of it, I do think he had an insight, one that he was too humble to ever take credit for, any special credit for. An insight that politics is really an extension of human nature played out on a grand scale. It is, after all, just the way we organize our collective behavior in ever larger groupings. There's not some alternate set of rules that kick in when big populations or nations are involved. Human nature stays the same. It is the one constant throughout all of history. And my father always came back to that. He always saw in the foibles and faults of our politics their root in our individual human nature. He believed the best politics was always organized around and adapted to human nature itself, with all its faults and all its imperfections. That's why he always had such reverence and awe for America's political system and its history, for our Constitution that was specifically designed for men and not for angels. It sought not to change human nature, not to shape us into new men for a new age or a perfect society. Rather, it accepted people as they are, with all the greed and opportunism and ambition we will always have, and instead to harness those natural drives, both the sinful and the virtuous, in a system that balances them out, that plays them all out against each other, to yield an open and free system where no man, no matter how virtuous or how sinful, can dictate to the rest. And it was the opposite of this kind of political system that my father always saw as the greatest of all threats. In politics that seeks not to adapt to human nature, but rather seeks to bend human nature to its own arbitrary notions of what might be right or good or quote-unquote true. This was the danger of utopian thinking, my father argued, of endeavoring to create perfect societies or perfect individuals. Nothing could be more anathema to human nature. And the quest to build such utopias, these political romanticisms, as my father called them, led to the greatest of human catastrophes and crimes and abominations, of absolutist and totalitarian systems that seek to remake humanity according to their ideology, that level everything high and beautiful, as my father put it, that stands in the way of that goal, of the French Revolution's reign of terror, of Mao's Cultural Revolution, of Stalin's purges, and of course, of Hitler's Holocaust. This knowledge of and constant awareness of human history and its interplay with human nature gave my father the perspective to see through much of the mundane arguments of our day-to-day politics and to see the core issues, the fundamental stakes that really mattered, the true world historical questions that lay at the heart of why we engage and why we debate about politics in the first place. He had this recognition in his mind always, of this vital importance of politics done right. And with that, he had a gratitude and a reverence for our own politics, America's constitutional democratic order, which he saw as surely mankind's greatest achievement in politics, the best embodiment of classical liberal democracy, of an open, pluralist, free society that has now endured and been so successful for almost 2.5 centuries. It is imperfect, to be sure, but for my father, that was exactly the point. Nothing human is ever perfect. Human nature is not built that way. And it is not built that way for a reason I think was closely linked in my father's worldview, that human knowledge and human understanding are very limited. My father was an incredibly intelligent and knowledgeable man, but that only gave him an ever deeper appreciation of just how little any of us really know in the grand scheme of things. About the universe, its origins and physical laws, about our world, about our own human nature, about even ourselves as individuals. And there's the psychiatrist again. It is hubris to think otherwise, and dangerous hubris to think we understand enough to rebuild societies from the ground up, to perfect human nature, or to dictate to others how best to think and live. This was the philosophical root, in large part, of my father's wariness of modern liberalism. As he put it, quote, 20th century liberalism's newfound perfectionist ambitions, reflected in its current euphemism, progressivism, sought to harness the power of government, the mystique of science, and the rule of experts to shape society and individual character and bring them both, willing or not, to a higher state of being, end quote. Throughout his entire life, my father was always wary of any ideology that claimed to know some singular, absolute, or unassailable truth. In fact, the very first article he ever published for the McGill Daily in 1969, when he was just 19 years old, was a critique of the extreme political left and right of that day, of what he termed monolithic political thinking and deadening one-dimensionality. It championed pluralism, whose underlying assumption, he wrote, is that no one has a monopoly on truth. My father was an ardent student and advocate of the great thinkers of the Enlightenment and classical liberalism, most of all, perhaps, John Stuart Mill, on whom my father wrote his thesis in political philosophy when he was studying at Oxford. He saw the vital necessity of a political system where no one has claim to absolute truth, where the competition of ideas, of debate, and of a pluralism of views and opinions defines politics and defines society. But he saw great wisdom, too, in the arguments of Burke and Chesterton, of the value and the need for tradition and continuity, and the dangers of constantly seeking to make the world anew. In this way, my father combined in his worldview both a classical liberalism and a modern conservatism, and both united above all by a deep humility and recognition of the limits of man's knowledge. An open, liberal, and pluralist society is the only one where, out of a cacophony of good and bad ideas, the best can successfully compete for relevance and gradually rise to the top, tested by logic and by evidence, and replace failed ideas and be incorporated into our communal lives. But we must remember, too, that new ideas are not necessarily better than old ones. In fact, it is perhaps more often the opposite. If an idea, a value, a way of life has survived in humanity for generations, we at least know that by definition it is not self-destructive, and very likely has at least some redeeming, stabilizing, or desirable qualities. A new idea, by its definition, is untested and full of potential for unseen and unintended consequences beyond our imaginings. There is no law that says new is better. If there is one thing my father made abundantly clear in enunciating the core of the conservative part of his worldview, it is that history is not redemptive, as he put it. It does not automatically and inevitably move toward progress and the good. It does not always bend towards justice. It can regress in every way that matters, and in the most terrible ways. That is what politics gone wrong can do. And as he wrote, that is not ancient history. That is Germany in 1933. This combination of liberal and conservative, of skeptical and reverential, made my father hard to pin down philosophically and politically. Though he described himself as conservative, and it certainly does fit him better than any other category we'd have, I often hesitate to use that word. He was an original thinker and a principled one. He didn't easily fit into ready-made labels. I like to think that if, as William F. Buckley put it, a conservative is someone who stands athwart history and yells stop, then I imagine my father in a slightly different position, standing athwart history and yelling think. He was not against change or political and societal and cultural evolution. He embraced it more than most of his conservative fellow travelers, I think, and for much that same reason, had a sunnier and more optimistic view of the future than a lot of conservatives do. But he was skeptical of change, and he was skeptical of any unproven claim to some new and previously undiscovered truth, simply because humanity, in all its unwisdom, has an extraordinary capacity for bad ideas. History has shown us that, and it is nothing but foolhardy to assume that we in our present day have some unique wisdom and insight into human nature and politics that our forefathers did not. We should always be open to change and improvement, for we inherit from the past much that is unjust and inhumane, but we should always be testing and thoughtful in the process, and always have both gratitude and reverence for the ideas that got us this far along in human progress in the first place, and not to discard them without serious thought and deliberation. Especially in America, where we have the incredible good fortune of inheriting the philosophical and political system that was bequeathed to us by those who came before. A system whose founding was, as my father put it, so fortuitous and so unlikely in the course of human history that he was at times moved to describe it as a miraculous or providential event. The great thinkers who explained and laid the foundation for the American experiment perhaps exemplify and embody my father's philosophy best of all. Jefferson, Madison, Tocqueville, my father came back to them time and again. They melded theory and practice, ideals and realities in a way that spoke to my father's core understanding of human nature, with all its contradictions and all its messiness. The system of limited government, of a free society that allowed individuals to pursue their own goals and find their own meaning in free association with others. This was their great gift, my father saw, the precious gift of the Enlightenment, as he put it, and it should be guarded by every generation, for it is a rare and precious thing in the history of mankind. My father put this sentiment most succinctly and wonderfully, I think, in a commencement speech he gave to McGill University, which is included in the point of it all. He wrote, quote, "Save the best, conserve what's best in the past. Tradition is the ultimate democracy because it extends the franchise to generations past and benefits from their hard-earned wisdom," end quote. One of the areas where I think this kind of thinking is most apparent and most poignant in my father's writing, both in the point of it all and throughout his career, was in talking about questions of medical ethics and of life and death decisions. In the 2000s, he served on the President's Council of Bioethics. In that capacity, he spent a great deal of time considering the intricacies and complex moral questions of stem cell research, bringing both his medical background and philosophical outlook to bear. On that issue and on related issues of abortion, end-of-life care, and assisted suicide, his argument was never black and white, never absolutist in any claim to ultimate knowledge of these deepest questions of human life and death. Instead, he grounded his argument in exactly that inability to know the ultimate truth. He beseeched us all to have humility in the face of these most awesome questions, and for that reason to err on the side of human life, rather than on the side of a pretended mastery of science or human nature. For once ancient and long-held moral boundaries on these most precious of human values are breached, he argued, the way back is a difficult one, and the ways forward to a brave new world of unintended consequences are many. This reverence for the unknown and the unknowable extend beyond politics for my father, and really to every aspect of life, from the deepest ruminations on the origins of the universe to the appreciation of lighthearted pastimes like an afternoon at the ballpark. That and everything in between are on full and, to me, a very beautiful display in the point of it all. Across all its chapters, my father wrote about everything from chess and movies and sports to fatherhood and friendship and his own subtle and understated philosophy of life. He downplayed the wisdom he brought to all these subjects in his own characteristic way, inserting wry humor and irreverent nods to the peculiarities and absurdities of life at every turn. But in so many ways, that was the quiet key to his insight. He downplayed his own understanding of all these things that fill life with such beauty and joy and meaning. Yet he used the artfulness of his writing to make you feel that very meaning deep in your own heart, somewhere just beyond your ability to fully understand and articulate it in your mind. And that's exactly where my father found it himself. It was a long and difficult process completing this book for my father, but a deeply rewarding one and meaningful one. In making sure that I didn't miss anything that ought to be in the point of it all, I went back and reread essentially everything he had ever written, almost 2,000 columns, essays, speeches, and other writings. It was quite an incredible and, I dare say, indescribable feeling going through all of that. But that experience is one that I think that everyone who reads his books will be able to have as well. My father's words in this book, as in all his writing, speaks to me in a very deep and powerful way. His words open my mind, they stir my spirit, and they move my heart. And I hope they will do the same for you. Thank you.
Very good. Here's one.
Test.
Yep. All yours. Go ahead. Okay, we'll take some questions. We have ushers in the aisles with microphones, and we find it very difficult to see anybody up here. Any questions? I see one right here. Yes, sir.
Okay, my question, first of all, it was an astounding and awesome speech. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Did your father or anybody in your family ever express an interest in actually getting in the game of politics versus observing it from the perimeter?
No, not really. I think my there were some half-joking campaigns to get my father to run for something at various times, but he would always joke he never wanted to work that hard. No, I think he felt that he had really found what he was meant to do. He actually often spoke about how grateful he felt that he had found that. And I think he thought that he was doing the best he could for himself and for the country where he was. So there was never really sought any more limelight than he already had.
Good. Here's one down here. We have a mic down here, please. Wait, Bill. No. Wait for it, please.
Daniel, was your dad particularly disturbed by the growing deadlock of the political dialogue the last couple of years? And what would he think of the recent election of seemingly very radical liberal candidates to Congress?
Yeah. Well, I won't try to speak to what he would say today, but I think what I can say and what's clear from everything he wrote is he abhorred the political extremes, right and left. And I think he was always clear about that was one of America's great blessings, really, was that it, for instance, never really had a far-right nationalist party or far-left socialist party the way that many European societies have for the last century. That's something he often spoke about. So I think you can draw your own conclusions to what he'd say about the current state of affairs. I think, he was still writing through the middle of 2017, so his views on the elections up through that point were clear, and he certainly wasn't happy with a lot of what was going on in either party. But I think specifically to the question of deadlock, in and of itself, I would say he was not necessarily against. I think if, as one was like him, a conservative who often thinks that government getting too involved is a bad thing, if government's deadlocked, that's part of the system and part of it working. So I think to a certain extent, he wouldn't criticize it in and of itself. But that's not to say he didn't call out political dysfunction and things not working the way they should in our constitutional system, which in particular could relate to how, I think, as he wrote, because there's so little on the major issues often argued out in the legislature, for instance, a lot of it gets outsourced to the judiciary, which he viewed as backwards to how the system should be working. So I would say, I guess in sum, there's two sides of the coin about deadlock.
Okay. Here's one in the middle.
The nuclear weapons joke about paranoia and delusions of grandeur was a gut punch to me. And has he said, and once again, you're not going to talk about what he might say, but what was his feelings about that actually happening, where a leader would have some weird, strange, horrible reason to push that button?
Yeah, I wouldn't worry too much based on that quote. And he had been saying that for at least 20 years, so hasn't come true yet. I think he wrote about this issue from time to time, and actually in more recent years, a lot in 2017 in particular, he wrote about this. And looking to what he wrote, I would say, I don't think he was kind of literally worried about, just the president waking up and pushing the button for no reason. But the problem is when you get into a crisis situation where, the stakes start to be raised, and you do get to a point where important decisions have to be made. And so certainly I think he thought the systems in place to, the way that we had handled things through the Cold War and to today, held well, but it's one of the reasons he was very critical of a lot of the presidential candidates, including the one who won, for when they would discard a lot of the inherited wisdom of how national security kept us safe for a long time, particularly on issues of deterrence, I would say is an example that he wrote about, of misunderstanding the reason and the purpose that we have deterrent threats out there, and how important those are to avoiding exactly the kind of potential ramping up of crisis situations that might possibly get us into something very dangerous. So, I would say not to, run for the bunker quite yet, but I do think as part of the kind of the political discussion, it starts there. It's not just the moment of maximum risk; it's all the conversations that frame that and lead up to it that are important to talk about and to argue in favor of the mindsets that have kept the worst from happening for many decades, when people for many decades also thought we wouldn't last.
Great. We have one up in the balcony.
Yes, Daniel, I think your dad was an inspiration on a two-pronged effort. One, when we read his columns, and long before we saw him on television, most of us didn't know that he was in a wheelchair. Sean Hannity always made that statement that he was almost embarrassed when he found out that he was when he met him for the first time. So an inspiration from his mind and what he thought and wrote, and also how he didn't let a severe handicap get in the way or any bitter feelings. What kind of an inspiration was he along those lines?
Yeah, well, what I would say about that is really just to follow on exactly how he lived his life with that injury, which for anyone who doesn't know, he had a diving accident when he was a young man that left him in a wheelchair. But he never let that change his life in the ways that mattered to him, never let it define him in any meaningful way. And I think he succeeded in that more than any of us could hope to. And I think the most powerful thing I ever heard him say about it, and to exactly my point, we didn't talk about it much, that's just life. And that was the whole point. And I discovered actually after he passed away in an interview, one of the few times he talked about it, he said, and I'm paraphrasing, but he basically said, look, everyone has their cross to bear, everyone. Some of those crosses are more visible and you can see them really easily. Some of them aren't. They're invisible and on the inside, and people bear them and suffer with them and no one ever knows. But everyone has something. Everyone has the slings and arrows of fate that are thrown their way. And the important thing in life is not to let those slings and arrows define you, not to be defined by what happens to you, but to define your own life, to chart your own path, to make your life what you want to be. And to me, that was just such a wonderful approach for absolutely everyone, which I think is exactly why I am actually open talking about it, because it's something I think he, again, never wanted to make a big deal of himself. But the fact that it is completely universal to everyone is the powerful part about it.
Anybody else? There's one.
Daniel, you're certainly your father's son, which take it as a compliment. With that legacy, when can we expect you on the nightly news?
Well, thank you. But as I was telling Bo earlier backstage, for my own part, my life's been a little upside down this last year and a half. I was kind of put my life on pause to be with my father when he was in the hospital, and in all the months since, I focused essentially 100% on finishing this book, doing all the work for it to make sure that it got the attention that it deserved, and dealing with other family matters. So I have yet to decide where my own life will go afterwards. I think I've made myself a promise to take a little time out when all of this is done and think about it. But I will say that I care deeply about all of these things and these ideas that my father cared about most deeply, and I just need to take some time to determine for myself where I can best make my own contribution.
Here's one down the middle. Here comes the mic.
Yes, I've been a big follower of your dad's for a long time. I'm wondering, with his Jewish background and his reverence for America's government and how it was founded in the Founding Fathers and based on Judeo-Christian principles. I'm just wondering, I've never kind of read this anywhere, how much did his religious beliefs, especially on a moral compass, impact his decisions about good politics, bad politics, and how that affected governance? I mean, did he share that with you privately? Or I've never heard him talk about,
Yeah, well,
this is how we do it in the Jewish faith, this is how Christians think. He kept it just very level.
Right. He did talk about this in a few long interviews that I have seen, and so I can speak to it a little bit. I mean, I would say his Judaism was incredibly important and central to who he was, but he did not consider himself a religious person, so to speak, in the kind of literal truth of the Bible or anything to that degree. He was raised in a very religious Orthodox household, but then found his own way to where he had incredible reverence for the traditions, the wisdom, the philosophy passed down through Jewish thought through the ages, and also, for that matter, the great thinkers and philosophers of Christianity and other religions. But I think he would say, or he did say, that so there was never a sense of he thought, oh, this religion's right or these teachings are right and therefore that translates to government. But he did have a real sense of the historical origins of a lot of our secular or whatever label you want to put on it, our morality today, and that morality doesn't just exist in a vacuum. And so, the train of thought, whether one considers it divinely inspired or just, the wonderful accident of humans coming upon that wisdom over the ages, he had great, as I said, reverence for, and thought that that's something that I think should be incorporated into, at least into the debates, not necessarily that one has, again, that kind of monopoly on truth just by dint of, God said this, but there's a reason these beliefs endured this long, even if you're not someone who believes that they were given from God. There's a reason that human societies have been successful with them, a reason why they've inspired and underlain a lot of the moral and legal systems that we have. So I think I'm summing up a lot of what he said in one shortened thought, but I think to his mind, dismissing that and pretending that one can make up one's own morality in a vacuum, so to speak, is kind of fooling oneself to a degree. And so, for instance, he was always very allergic and annoyed by debates when people say, oh, you can't argue this political viewpoint because you only say that because your religion says it, like on abortion or whatever else. And there are several columns where my father said, well, why is it you can be motivated to argue a political point from veganism or human rights or vegetarian or whatever you want it to be, and the only thing accepted is religion? There's something backwards about that either you have to draw morality from somewhere, and I think he saw religion as an incredibly central, important part of that to American society and to human life.
Yeah, we have time for one more. There's one in the middle.
Yes, how did your father organize his normal workday?
This is one that, Yeah, I know, with a great deal of accuracy. I'll do the week instead because he was really on a weekly schedule because he was his column always came out on Fridays. And so, generally the way it worked was Monday was thinking day. Tuesday, also mostly thinking day. And by thinking mostly, I mean it just essentially reading all day, looking at what's happening, thinking up ideas, jotting down what potential candidates would be. By the end of Tuesday, he'd have a few candidates narrowed down. Wednesday, he would write it front to back. He did it by dictation for the first draft, and then he would edit. And so after that initial draft, it was just all editing Wednesday through Thursday, right till the deadline. And he said that's really where he found his columns, was in the editing, because he was a incredible perfectionist and maybe masochist on some of that. He said he loved to polish his columns and kind of ground them down to be just right. And then later on, when he started doing more and more TV, that kind of got added on as an extra layer at the end of the day. So he'd drive over from his office downtown to Fox News, I guess around 6 o'clock. Then he'd be on, around 6:40 with Brett. And then if it was baseball season, he would immediately jump into his car and head for Nationals Park, which, as he described it, if the winds were fair, was a 7-minute drive. And so that was always his favorite end to the day.
Great. Can we have a round of applause for Daniel, please?
Thank you very much.